If you're a chiropractor based in Sydney, then you're going to want to watch this entire video because I'm going to show you my step-by-step process on how to rank #1 for the keyword chiropractor Sydney CBD. And let's jump right into it. Alrighty, jumping into SEMrush, I've plugged in our target keyword, which is chiropractor Sydney CBD. I'm going to scroll down to the results, and basically I'm going to be choosing a random business to analyze for this video. And I've selected one on page 2. So if we go down to position 12, Wynyard Chiro. So this is their website here. This is a website that I'll be analyzing, and I've specifically chosen this one because we can see that they sit just outside of that first page. So with a few tweaks and optimizations, we should be able to break into the first page in the short term. So this website here isn't doing too bad, but there's definitely areas that they could improve on, which we'll focus on. And typically what I like to start with first is the site crawl. So we're going to use Screaming Frog for this analysis. And basically this tool will give us a full crawl of the website, and we'll be able to see what we're working with and what all of the pages on their site looks like from a technical perspective. Now, with Screaming Frog, what's really cool is that you can add in APIs from a bunch of different analytics tools. So typically, if this was my client and I had access to all of their tools like Google Analytics 4, Google Search Console, and PageSpeed Insights, I would actually connect these up for this website, and this will give us additional data points for each of the URLs, and we'll be able to analyze at a deeper level as to how they're performing. Now, obviously, since this isn't my client, we're not going to be able to connect these up. So basically what we're going to do is just plug in the URL, we're going to start the crawl, and then once it's complete, we're going to jump into a Google Sheet and do some analysis on the results. Okay, so once the site crawl is complete, you're going to want to export your results into a Google Sheet. Now, I've just pasted them into this sheet and I've titled this tab as crawl. Now, for the purposes of this audit, I'm going to be focusing only on the indexable pages. So this means these are pages that actually appear in the search results. Now, for obvious reasons, that's what we want to focus on for an SEO analysis. So really the purpose of this step is to get visibility over how their site is structured and to try and pinpoint opportunities where we can either consolidate content, improve existing content, and just kind of see how their technical site performance is looking from a high level. So starting with a couple of things that I've noticed, looking at this address column, immediately I can see that there's URLs that are either quite dated and contain the year. Now, from an SEO perspective, best practice is actually not to include the year within the URL. And the simple reason for this is that it makes it quite difficult to update that content. And it can make it look dated once that year has passed. So for example, if we look here, there's a couple from 2022. Now, if we wanted to update these, we would actually have to update the URL, which means any backlinks or any link equity that this page has would need to be redirected. So it can get quite messy and it can make it quite complicated for a very simple task. So best practice would be just to have it as /back to school. And then you can update that same URL every year if you wanted to focus on that topic. So there's a couple of opportunities there in terms of the year being in the URLs. Now, just in terms of the content itself, if we open up this one, for example, now if this is basically dated content where it needs to be updated every year, then essentially we would need to have one URL here, like I mentioned, and then we just update the same page. And then the other thing is we look at some of these older pages. If these are no longer required because they've already passed and there's no link equity going to these pages, these could actually be removed because we can see it hasn't actually been updated since 2022. So in terms of consolidation and just streamlining their site crawl budget, there's definitely opportunities here that we could consolidate some of these URLs and just remove the ones that are no longer required. Now, in terms of these tags, this is a very simple fix. These usually should not be indexed for obvious reasons because you're going to create a lot of different URLs that don't actually add value to the website. So these tags can easily be just marked as no index. So if we have a look in this detailed SEO extension, we can see that these are actually indexable, and these can be simply just removed from the index, and that will actually help the crawl budget as well, which is important, and we'll touch on in a moment as well. So a couple of opportunities there from a URL perspective. There's quite a few tags, there's quite a few categories that could also potentially be removed from the index, author pages, unless they are important, because we can see here they're not actually descriptive enough to a specific person. These can be removed from the index as well. Now, the interesting thing I noticed here is that there are a lot of blog posts that are not actually relevant to a chiropractor. Now, I don't know exactly what the purpose behind these blog posts were, but these ideally, they should be removed if they've accidentally been published on the site. Now, if they do have an angle where they are related to their chiropractor services, it should be made clearer, because if we open up a couple of these, it is quite odd because they really just look like recipes for certain dishes or ingredients that they're suggesting. So a little bit strange there as to why these are on the website. So and there's quite a few. So these could be removed if it's not relevant to the primary service, or there's no real angle as to how they're contributing to topical authority. So again, it's a fairly simple fix. They're not relevant. They can be removed. And then if we look over to the right here, and I think this is one of the most impactful changes that Wynyard Chiro could implement, is their title structure. So they've got this here, your Sydney CBD chiropractor. This is basically in almost every URL. So it looks like some sort of a structural issue where the titles are being modified to include this in every page. So most likely a plugin where this is being inputted for every page, but for obvious reasons, this actually is not good for SEO, because essentially you're creating keyword cannibalization issues where all of these pages that include your Sydney CBD chiropractor, they're actually competing against each other. So given that the Sydney CBD chiropractor is their primary keyword, this should really only be targeted on one page, which looks like would be their homepage, and it's actually already in there. So this section here from every title can actually be removed, and that will simplify their title structures, and also it will remove this internal competition that's being created across all of these pages. So very big thing that's affecting all of their pages, and something that's very simple to fix. And as we noticed, they're ranking just outside of that first page for Sydney CBD chiropractor. These sort of minor fixes can actually go a long way to moving you up a couple of positions. And in this case, it would move them into the first page, which could be huge. So that can be fixed up. And then in terms of the rest of the titles, there's a few here that really shouldn't be in there, which we've touched on, that can be removed from the index. And then here we can see there's paginated URLs that can also be removed. And then we touched on the blog posts, and then there's a couple of here that I just duplicated across, again, because of pagination. So some cleaning up that can be done across all these pages and dated pages. Yeah, quite a bit that can be done from a title tag perspective. And then obviously cleaning up the site will just remove a lot of pages that aren't really contributing to their SEO performance, or really not driving any traffic from any channel. So that can be cleaned up. Now, if we have a look over to the right here, there's some pages that are missing meta descriptions. This is a very minor issue from an SEO perspective, but just something you want to tick off. So it's important just to plug in a meta description that's relevant to each page. And again, something that's very simple to do. Wouldn't necessarily move the needle massively, but it's just something you want to tick off. Now, one of the things I really want to touch on is their heading tag structure. So if we go back to their page and have a look at one of their service pages, one of the things that's really concerning here is this heading tag structure. So they've got 3 H1 tags. They've got dry needling, welcome, we're here to help. So there's some structural issues, and this is across all of their service pages. Usually from an SEO perspective, best practice is to have one really clear H1 tag. This just makes it easier for Google to be able to understand the context and what the page is actually about. Now, if you have multiple H1s, it can actually make it quite difficult to decipher what the page is about, and especially in this case where you have non-descriptive H1s. So this seems to be a structural issue where this header is the same across all pages. So they've duplicated the H1 tags and there's just too many there. So this needs to be cleaned up to have really only one really clear H1 tag, and H2s, but basically the rest of them can be moved to H2s. So like I mentioned, this is occurring in quite a few pages. So if you see multiple H1s, that is a problem and that can be cleaned up. And then everything else looks okay from a technical perspective. There are a few pages, if you look in the crawl depth, that are sort of beyond one. Usually you don't want to go beyond 3 pages deep, especially if they're important pages. Now, in this case, we need to do more of a deeper analysis to see what these pages are, but just from an initial glance, most of these pages are ones that I've recommended could be removed anyway. So not too much to do there, but overall, we can see that there's quite a few opportunities to consolidate some pages, remove some pages, update H1 tags, and remove multiple H1 tags across all of their pages, and then just make sure that they have a really clear H1 tag that defines what that service is, and that would actually go a long way to improving their rankings for Sydney CBD especially. Now, the other thing I want to mention here is when you look at some of their service pages, so if we go to Backpain, all of this looks okay. It looks very specific to Backpain. Now, this section here is actually a cookie cutter section, and what I mean by that is this occurs on every service page. So on Backpain, if we look at neck pain, we'll find this same section occurs here as well. And this is a bit of a problem because they've put in the keyword here, and this changes across all of the different conditions, but this content remains the same. So we actually got some duplicate content issues here where it's occurring on all of the pages. Ideally, we want to have really hyper-targeted and relevant content for each of these conditions. So if this covers all of the content that they want to include for neck pain, for example, then this really should not be in there. And if they just want to include some information around consultation and how that works, this could be condensed a lot more into a simple section. But having a lot of this content across all these pages would be creating duplicate content issues that definitely should not be there. So that can be removed, and that will help to just make sure that all these pages are unique. Otherwise, the page structure looks pretty good. The content looks reasonably detailed, but we'll jump into a little bit more of that in a second. And then in terms of their service pages, one thing I want to point out here is that they've got this page called Chiropractic Care. Looks very similar to what is on the homepage. And if we look at the title, obviously we've got this in there, which we've touched on, but chiropractic care is also mentioned on the homepage here. So there's a case here for this page to actually be removed. Again, it could be causing internal competition. There really isn't a whole lot of unique content on this page. This is also cookie cutter content. So there's a couple of sections here that, if they're not mentioned on the homepage, could actually just be consolidated on here. But this page makes a lot more sense to target both chiropractic care and Sydney CBD chiropractic services on the same page, because they are related and they have the same intent. Now, the next step is to start looking at their sitemap. So we've already had a look at their technical site setup. We've had a look at their site architecture and just overall how their pages are structured based on their URL structure, their titles, and the content. Now, what I want to do is start to actually optimize each of their URLs for the target keywords that they want to rank for. So basically what I've done is I've split up these columns by keyword, intent, URL, and then status and title. So Over to the far left, we have the target keyword. So this is the keyword that we actually want the page to rank for. The intent, now there's different kinds of search intents, but for the purposes of local SEO, we're going to keep it simple. We really just want to focus on commercial intent, which is people actively looking for the service, and then informational intent, which is a little bit further up the funnel, but we also want to nurture those audiences through informational content. So I'm going to touch on the commercial side first. With this first one here, Dry Needling Sydney, I like to have a really clean URL structure. And the way I like to explain it is if we have a look at their current structure, which is very similar, but there's just a minor distinction there. If you look at their primary domain, usually what I like to suggest is to have the URL structure really clean and really self-explanatory as to what the page is about. Because if you remove this primary domain, winyoudchiro.com.au, and you only look at the / this should tell Google specifically what the page is about without actually including other keywords that aren't relevant. So in this case, dry needling is fine, but we also want to just be a little bit more specific and mention that it is in Sydney. So I've just made a simple change here, which would be Dry Needling Sydney. And this would be the same across all of these different service areas. We just want to include the city that they're focusing on, and we also want to include the target keyword that's in there. So for Dry Needling Sydney, simple change, we'll include the city. And then for the title, we'll have dry needling sessions, just to make it really clear as to what the service is. So dry needling itself isn't quite specific enough as to the fact that this is actually a service they provide, and this isn't just information about dry needling. So just a small distinction again, which would be dry needling sessions, and then we'll have the brand name. And then for the H1 tag, it'll be dry needling sessions in Sydney CBD. So very similar, just a little bit more user friendly. And it's important to remember here that the H1 tag is actually what the user can see on the website. So up here would be the H1, and that's visible. The title is actually what appears in the search results page. So that will be this here. So the H1 always needs to be a little bit more user friendly and actually needs to make sense in the context of what the person is reading about. So very simple structure. We'll replicate that across all of their services. Now, this next one here, cold laser therapy, this one actually needs a bit of a change in terms of how the heading and the URL is structured. So this just says cold laser, which again is not specific enough. So I've put in cold laser therapy, Sydney. Same with the title. It's actually cold laser therapy. It's not just information about cold laser. And then the H1 tag's a little bit more descriptive as to the location. So I won't go through all of them, but basically we want to replicate this structure across all of their specific conditions that they treat and the different service areas that they have. So that would be their commercial intent keywords. Now, moving on to the informational content, I've come up with some ideas here, and there's so many that you can come up with just by manual research of broad topics. So when you look at back pain, for example, there's many different topics that you can come up with just in SEMrush alone. Now, the key here is when we look at local relevance, we want to create content that's actually relevant to the city we want to focus on. So in this case, for chiropractors in Sydney, we want to find angles where we can create content that's specific to people in Sydney. And this can be a little bit tricky because some of these are quite broad. So when you look at topics like back pain, neck pain, or just broadly chiropractic tips, it can be tricky to really personalize that for the city, but that's what we want to focus on. And if you can do this well, then you can really differentiate yourself from all of the other chiropractors in Sydney, because there's so many of them that will just create general and broad content that's not really targeted towards the city. And you can actually use AI for this as well. And that's basically what I've done. So all I've done is I've gone into SEMrush. I've plugged in the sort of broad keywords that we want to focus on. So back pain, for example, and I've looked at topic ideas that I could convert into Sydney specific content assets. And I've basically gone into ChatGPT and asked it to give me ideas for back pain that are specific to Sydney. And really the key here is to come up with ideas. You can use AI for brainstorming and really just generating relevant ideas for Sydney, but then you still need to be able to produce that content yourself and have it really personalized to that city. And one thing I want to mention here is you don't want to just create broad content and then just plug in the city, because Google can see through that. It's machine learning. It's very smart now. Something that worked back in the day definitely would not work now. So you do want to make sure that the topics you choose have local variability. And what I mean by that is that the topic is actually specific to the city, and that something would change if you move that topic from Sydney to Melbourne to Perth. And it could just be a subtle change, but you want to make sure that there is some relevance to that locality. So it's touching on some of these here. If we look at this first one, how Sydney's office workers can prevent tech neck and back pain, you'll see here that it's specific to Sydney's office workers. Now, the second one is your commute wrecking your spine, chiropractic tips for Sydney commuters. And then the third one is back pain in the Sydney winter. So you see that they're all different intent. So we don't want to create content that's all the same. They're very different intent and very specific types of search intent that's specific to Sydney. So we'll talk about Sydney office workers, Sydney commuters, and then Sydney winter. So they're all sort of specific to the location, the climate, and things that really have local variability based on where people live. And this content will actually be touching on specifics around Sydney trains, the Sydney commuting experience, things that can impact people that actually commute a lot in terms of their spine or other chiropractic conditions that can sort of manifest just from their lifestyle, which again would be specific to Sydney. Even if it's a minor difference, it's something you really want to emphasize when you create content for Sydney specific chiropractic services. Okay, so once your sitemap is optimized, the next step is to start looking at the on-page content and to see if there's opportunities to further optimize the content to be more specific to our target keywords. And we're going to be starting with the commercial intent keywords because obviously these are the keywords that will move the needle the most for chiropractic services in Sydney CBD. So starting with dry needling Sydney, the aim of this step is really to look at the on-page content and to see where the improvement areas are. So this is the existing content, and we're going to be using Surfer SEO to analyze its content. So I've plugged in the primary keyword and I've pasted in the existing content. So this has had no changes made to it at the moment. And the focus area here is this NLP section. So these terms are extracted from the top 10 ranking results for this keyword. And basically what it shows us is how well optimized this content is for each of these phrases. And I want to emphasize here that by optimize, what I mean is that the local relevance that they have for dry needling services in Sydney. Because again, we're not just focusing on dry needling information. We want to make it clear that we're offering dry needling services in Sydney CBD. So in this case, when you look at these NLP terms, this is really the different sections and the depth that we need to have. And we're not trying to basically stuff these terms into the content to improve the score, because really this is an arbitrary score. It's not based on the user friendliness or the actual depth of the content from a keyword perspective. It's really just looking at what is already ranking. So we need to have a nuanced approach as to what's relevant and what's not. Now, typically the way these NLP keywords are structured is the most relevant are at the top, and as you go further down, they become more loosely relevant. So you kind of have to use your judgment here, but again, the key here is to really identify sections that we need to modify, potentially remove if they don't actually have relevance to the primary topic, and then other sections that we potentially need to include and areas that we need to cover. So again, the aim is not to stuff these in because that's really not what's going to create good content. The aim is to use these as a guide to create a really well optimized and relevant piece of content to dry needling in Sydney. So with that said, we can see here that this page scores at 39 out of 100. And these ones that are highlighted in orange are the ones that are actually missing from the page. So we can see dry needling Sydney is actually not mentioned very often. Now, these sort of keywords, it's fairly normal to not have them within the content just because it doesn't read super naturally. So when you look at dry needling Sydney, you could have that in the title or the H1 tag, but you probably would not have that within the content itself. So it does need to make sense and it needs to be readable. So there's a couple of ways that you can start to optimize this content. Now, usually what I like to do is to jump into ChatGPT, and that's a really great way to start to build a foundation for your content, and then we can start to write out that content from the outline that it gives you. So if we jump into ChatGPT here, All I've done is I've started to give it some context as to what we want. So I've said provide a detailed content outline for this keyword dry needling. I've also copied in all of these NLP keywords and provided them here. So these are all the NLP terms that I want it to include, and only where it's relevant. Again, we're not trying to stuff these in. We're only focusing on relevance. And then the final step I've done is to actually include a little bit about the business. So when you Chiro, I've gone into their Teams page, exported this content and given it to ChatGPT. So what this will do is give us a really personalized piece of content. And this is a very, very important step, because if you're going to use AI to come up with an initial foundation, you want it to be specific to your business. And by providing more information on what you do and your services and your teams, your mission, anything that's relevant to your business, provide that, because that's going to give you an edge against all the other chiropractors in Sydney. So I've provided all this information. I've asked it to come up with an outline. It's given us a really in-depth content outline for this keyword. And then I've asked it to create the first draft based on the word count that Surfer SEO is suggesting, which we can see here is roughly about 1,200 to 1,400. And then it's actually given us a really well optimized piece of content here. And I've plugged this back into Surfer SEO. So you'll see here, and already just from the first draft, we've had a really nice boost in the score. So originally it was 39, it's boosted up to 49. And more importantly, if you look down at the NLP section, it's actually covered a lot more terms within the content. If we look at the original, we can see a lot of these are missing. Now, again, you can see that we're still not including this primary one. So there's opportunities there to further optimize this content. And like I mentioned, this is really just a first draft. It's to give you the sort of structure that you want to focus on. Once you have this initial draft, you actually want to work with your editorial or content team to build this out specifically for your business. In this next step, we're going to look at site authority. Now, you can do everything else right. You can have the most optimized site architecture. You can have really good content. But ultimately, if your site authority does not stack up against the top ranking sites, it's going to be really difficult for you to be able to rank and to be able to hold those positions. So what we want to start by looking at is the existing site authority that your business has. So in this case, for Wynyard Chiro, if we jump into SEMrush, we can see that their existing site authority is a little bit low. So they have about 116 referring domains. And a lot of these URLs are actually quite low authority. So we can see about 85% of them fall into the 0 to 10 DA score, and then about 7% 11 to 20. So it looks like they have a couple of decent links, but ultimately their site authority is quite weak compared to the top competitors. Now, in terms of improving your site authority, there's quite a few different ways you can go about link building. The one I always like to start with first is to do a link gap analysis, because this will tell you what links specifically your competitors have that you could potentially try and target as well. Now, as an important distinction there is that you can't always acquire all of the links that your competitors have, just because they may have certain angles, certain connections in the way that they've acquired those links. But certainly as a starting point, you can start to map it out what those opportunities look like. So a simple way is to use SEMrush's backlink gap analysis. I've simply just looked at the top ranking results for chiropractors in Sydney CBD. So this is our domain, and then we've got these two competitors here that have good link profiles and they're ranking well for this keyword. So here we can see all of the links that they have that Wynyard Chiro does not have. Now, you do want to use a nuanced approach here, because despite the fact that these websites have good link profiles, there's a good chance that they have a lot of low quality links as well. And you don't want to replicate links that are not good quality. So in this case, if you look through here, and this is just sorted by authority score, there's definitely a lot of links here that you'd want to investigate further to see if they're actually links that you want to target. Now, just from an initial glance, we can see a lot of these are directory listings, which wouldn't necessarily harm your site, but they really wouldn't move the needle that much either. There's quite a few Web 2.0s, which really are not recommended anymore. So yeah, use a nuanced approach, look through the links that your competitors have and try and find ones that good quality, but more importantly, that they're actually relevant to chiropractic services, and specifically that they are in Australia, because you can acquire a lot of links that have .com domains based in the US and other countries, which isn't necessarily an issue. But from a local perspective, we're trying to build local relevance. So we want to focus on .com.au domains. So have a look through your existing competitors, see what you can find, and you can really find some good opportunities just as a starting point from this process alone. Now, next step I would suggest, and this is really recommended whether you have a good link profile or not, is to look at local citations. So these are basically mentions of your business. So you have your business name, business address, and business phone number. And you want to have these listed across all of the important and relevant directories in your target city and within the country. So at the local level, you'd have Sydney and then Australia. Try and get listed on as many directories as possible. Now, these are what I would call foundational links. So these aren't necessarily going to move the needle massively in terms of site authority or rankings, but it's really important to have that solid foundation in place, because with this process, you get listed on some decent authority sites amongst other chiropractors that are also listed on there. It'll just help to give you a nice little boost in your foundation for link building. So when it comes to local citations, it is a manual process. There's a lot of different providers that can build these for you. You can also build these manually. It's just a bit of a time-consuming process. So usually I like to recommend Loganics. They have a local citation building service that they can create basically hundreds of them in a very short amount of time. So they have a good process to do this, and they do it manually. So it's all pretty natural. Now, usually I recommend you build at least 150 to 200 local citations, just depending on how many locally relevant directories you can find. Again, you can do this yourself or you can use a service. It really doesn't matter. The goal is to build those foundational links. And then once you have that foundation in place, you can start to build upon your link profile and try and find opportunities beyond just the foundational links that you have. So one of the techniques I want to mention here is at the local level. A really easy way to build links is to look for sponsorship opportunities. So I've just gone into Google, typed in sponsors plus Sydney. This will give us a list of websites that, number one, accept sponsorships, and number two, that they actually link out to the websites that provide those sponsorships. Now, in this case, not all of these sites will actually link out. So it's important to find opportunities where they do link out to the businesses that have become a sponsor. And I'll show you an example here of one that you would actually ideally like to target. So Sydney Build Expo, we can see that these are all their sponsors, and you can actually click on the logos and they link out to those sites. So these are the kinds of opportunities that you want to find for sponsorships, and you can go through quite a few of these. There's so many that come up, and really it's a very simple process in terms of outreach. You just want to find opportunities, reach out to them, simply ask them, how does your sponsorship process work? What are the different investment levels, and how do I get listed on your sponsorships page? So keep it simple, and then try and get listed on as many of these as possible. And this is a great way to build locally relevant links, because these will all be companies or businesses that are actually based in Sydney. So that's, again, a simple way to improve your link building process. Now, if you want to branch out further, I'm going to give you another tip, which is to try and find guest posting opportunities on relevant sites. So simply want to do a search for a broad keyword for chiropractic services. I've just gone for back pain, guest posts, and I specifically want to find websites that have a .au domain. And again, this is important for the local level. We want to build local relevance. We want to focus on sites that are actually in Australia. Now here you'll see all of the different sites that actually most likely accept guest posts and that they are based in Australia. So a key nuance here is that you will find some sites that are also chiropractors. Now, obviously, they're not going to link out to competing businesses, so those are the ones you would want to ignore. But you will find some informational sites that just talk about health and wellness broadly, and those are the kinds of ones that you want to focus on. So, for example, if we look at this one here, Right On Magazine, we can find that they have an existing guest post written by someone in the past. Now we can see that this is quite dated, so this is a bit of a manual process. You'd have to look through the sites that you find, and then do manual outreach to ask them if they're still accepting guest posts. But more importantly, you also want to have a look at the website itself and make sure that it's, number one, relevant, number two, that it does have some site authority and you can use SEMrush to find this information, and number three, that they are based in AU, which we've already filtered down to. So again, there'll be quite a few opportunities come up, and this is just for back pain. You can modify this for different types of chiropractic services. The final step of the local ranking process is to look at your local rankings in the map pack. So when you do a search for a service in a certain area, so in this example, we're looking at chiropractors in Sydney CBD, you'll see that this local pack appears above all of the other results. And this is why it's really important to optimize for local intent keywords, because this is actually taking up a lot of real estate on the page and it appears above all of the other pages. So even if you rank organically for Chiropractor Sydney CBD, these businesses would appear above yours. So it's very important to be appearing in these top 3 positions. Now you notice here that it only shows 3 results, and then the rest you actually have to click onto the rest of the results page to get to. So what you want to really aim for is these top 3 rankings, because this is where the majority of traffic and attention would go towards. And so when we look at the rest of the results here for Chiropractor Sydney CBD, we can see that the business we've been looking at, Wynyard Chiro, is further down the page. So they're quite a bit away from those top ranking results that we want to aim for. Now, when it comes to local pack rankings, there's a few things that are really important. Number one is your physical location obviously needs to be within the proximity of this target area that's being searched for. Number two is the reviews. Now, this can't be understated, because the customer reviews that you have, both in terms of the average rating and the quantity of reviews, is so important when it comes to determining where you rank in the local pack. So you can tick off where you are physically, because obviously in this case, we're looking at Sydney CBD. We know that they're based in Wynyard. But when we look at the overall review counts, we can see here, if we scroll past these sponsored results, these top 3 ranking results have over 200 reviews. Now, this third one has over 300 reviews. So the review quantity and average rating are really important. And what you want to start to do here is look at where the gaps are. So you start to build an average ranking of the reviews. So when you look at these top 3, I'm going to come up with the average number of reviews that these top 3 results have, which in this case roughly would be somewhere around 200 to 300 reviews. Now, when we look at Wynyard Chiro, they've got 85 reviews, so there's quite a bit of a gap there in terms of where they need to be at. You really want to aim to have at least as many reviews as the top ranking results. And then the next step would be to go beyond those reviews, because really to be able to rank and maintain those positions, you need to be outdoing your competitors. So you need to have a buffer of 10 to 15% above what they have. And this is really an ongoing process, because obviously the competitors will be constantly acquiring reviews, and that's something you need to focus on and have a really strong process in place for acquiring reviews from happy customers. So really key step there, work out the averages of number of reviews and try and aim to meet that average and then go beyond it to be able to maintain those positions. So we can see there is a bit of a gap there. There's quite a high number of reviews that these top 3 results have. But encouragingly, when you go beyond those top 3, we can see that there's one here that has 67, which is less than the business we're examining. And there's a couple here that are just a little bit under 200. But for the most part, you'll see that a lot of these businesses have around about 200 reviews. So at the very least, that's a number we should be aiming for. Now, when it comes to the Google Business Profile itself, there's a couple of things that we can do to further optimize it. Obviously, number one thing is to keep it really well updated, make sure all of the fields are populated, make sure that your category is correct and that it matches the rest of the competitors. So we can see that they're labeled as chiropractor, which seems really relevant. And then if we look at some of these top ranking results, it's the same category. So very simple thing, but that's something you want to tick off. And then just in terms of the content, you want to make sure that you are regularly updating your photos and videos, updating posts wherever possible. I usually like to recommend at least a couple of posts on your Google Business Profile every week, just to keep it really well updated and to show Google that your business is actually active. And obviously we touched on the reviews, but one of the things that's really important is to have descriptive reviews. Now, what I mean by that is to have mentions of the specific services that your customers use. So you'll see at the top here that the Google actually highlights some of the keywords that it thinks are relevant to what the person has searched for. So we see here it refers to knee and ankle conditions, the experience, the different types of services that they've offered. So really important to you give your customers some pointers as to what you want them to include in the review. I'm not suggesting that you write the review for them, but sometimes it can just help to give them a bit of an idea as to what they should include. Obviously, giving honest reviews is important, and just really mentioning specifically what they liked about your business, whether it's to do with the service, whether it's to do with your expertise, and just the overall experience. So the more descriptive a review can be, the better it is in terms of Google actually being able to understand what your business offers and positioning your business correctly for search terms that match the services that you offer. Now, a secondary benefit of having really descriptive customer reviews is how visible you are on AI searches. And what I mean by that is Google's AI bots, obviously that appears for a number of searches now. So if you get it mentioned on there, then you can start to drive some relevant traffic and occupy more real estate on the page. But then other tools like ChatGPT, a lot of people are starting to look for local businesses on there as well. And you want to make sure that you are being recommended. And one of the most important things that LLMs like ChatGPT use is your overall reputation of the business. So what are people saying about it? How often is it mentioned? In what context is it mentioned? And that's why having really descriptive reviews about your business are important trust signals to these tools, both AI and to Google, that your business is reputable and that people should be going towards there if they're looking for chiropractic services. And that's how you start to get more recommendations across AI tools and start to diversify your traffic sources. Okay, so that's how I would go about ranking a chiropractor in Sydney CBD. If you found this video useful, please give it a like and subscribe as it helps to grow the channel. And if you are a chiropractor in Sydney and you'd like a similar audit done for your website, please feel free to reach out. I'd be more than happy to do a similar audit for your business. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.